Before you hear this story, understand this. It really happened. Men were executed in secret, behind prison walls, and America barely noticed. What you're about to hear changed how justice works forever. Subscribe now, because stories like this were meant to be forgotten. The rope was already hanging when the prison doors closed. Inside the stone walls, the air felt heavy, thick, and silent. No crowd waited outside. No cheers, no protests, no last words shouted into the wind. This time, the executions were hidden, locked away, executed behind bars. In June of 1877, 10 men would die in Pennsylvania prisons. They would not see the sky again. They would not walk to a public gallows. The state had decided something new. Death would now happen in secret. These men were called murderers, terrorists, labor radicals. The newspapers used a darker name, the Molly Maguires. As guards tightened the nooses and checked the trapdoors, one question hung heavier than the rope itself. Were these men killers who deserved death, or workers crushed by power, fear, and betrayal? The prison bell rang once. Then the floor dropped. And with that moment, America crossed a line it could never step back from. But the story did not begin in a prison. It began deep underground. Long before the hangings, before the trials, before the ropes were tied, there were mines. Dark, narrow tunnels carved into the hills of Pennsylvania. Men worked there every day, breathing coal dust, risking cave-ins, and earning barely enough to survive. The year was the 1870s, and coal powered America. It lit homes, moved trains, and fed factories. The mine owners grew rich, the workers did not. Most miners were immigrants. Many were Irishmen who had fled hunger and violence back home. They hoped America would give them a future. Instead, they found danger, debt, and control. Mine owners owned everything: the land, the houses, the stores, even the law. If a miner spoke out, he could be fired. If he complained, he could be blacklisted. If he protested, he could be beaten or jailed. Deaths were common: explosions, collapses, flooded tunnels. Widows and children were left with nothing. Anger grew quietly at first. Then it grew louder. Stories spread of a secret group, a brotherhood that protected miners when no one else would. A group that answered violence with violence. They were called the Molly Maguires, named after an old Irish resistance legend. Some said the Mollys threatened cruel bosses. Others said they burned property. Some said they killed. Others said they only scared the powerful. What was true and what was rumor became hard to tell. Fear took over the coal towns. Mine owners demanded action. Politicians listened. Lawmen were paid, and a plan was made to destroy the Mollys from the inside. A man named James McParlan was sent in. McParlan was a detective, hired by a private agency and paid by mine owners. He lived among the miners, drank with them, worked beside them. He listened, he remembered names, he wrote everything down. For years, he watched and waited. When the arrests finally came, they came fast. Men were dragged from their homes, shackled, locked into cells, charged with murder and conspiracy. Some charges were based on witness stories, some on fear, some only on McParlan's word. The trials were rushed. Juries were chosen quickly. Many jurors were connected to mine owners. Lawyers were overworked. The courtroom mood was already set. The verdicts came back guilty. The sentences were death. At first, people expected public executions. That was how it had always been done. Crowds would gather, newspapers would sell, justice would be seen. But 1877 was different. America was tense. Labor strikes were exploding across the country. Railroads were shut down. Workers were angry everywhere. Leaders feared that public hangings would turn the executed men into heroes. So the state made a quiet choice. The executions would happen inside prison walls. No crowds, no speeches, No witnesses except guards and officials. On the morning of the executions, the condemned men were woken early. Some prayed, some stayed silent, some still claimed innocence. They were led down stone corridors, chains echoing with every step. The gallows stood waiting in the prison yard or execution room. No songs were sung, no warnings were shouted. The trapdoors fell. One by one, the men were pronounced dead. Outside the prisons, life continued as if nothing had happened. But inside the coal regions, something changed forever. Fear spread among workers. Meetings stopped, voices lowered, strikes weakened. The message was clear: challenge power and the prison will end you. Yet questions refused to die. Years later, historians would uncover troubling facts. Witnesses who changed stories, confessions made under pressure, evidence that vanished. A detective who admitted the goal was not justice, but control. Were all the executed men guilty? No one could say for sure. But they were dead, and the prisons had done their job. The hangings of 1877 became a turning point. Executions moved away from public view. The prison became a place not just of punishment, but of silence. The state had learned something powerful: kill quietly, let fear do the rest. As the last body was taken down and the prison doors locked again, officials believed the problem was solved. They were wrong, because the hangings did not end anger. They buried it, and buried anger has a way of coming back. In the next chapter, the truth behind the trials will surface. The secret deals, the witnesses who lied, and the moment when one man realized he had helped build a system that could destroy anyone. The prison had closed its doors, but the real horror was just beginning.
The cell doors slammed shut, but the echoes of the hangings did not fade. Across the coal towns of Pennsylvania, men stopped talking. Taverns went quiet. Union meetings disappeared overnight. Every miner understood the message the prison hangings of 1877 had sent. The state was watching, and the prison was waiting. But behind the silence, something darker was moving. Inside the prisons, guards whispered that the executions were rushed. Outside, families of the dead begged for answers. Wives asked why their husbands had been chosen. Children asked why their fathers never came home. No one gave them the truth, because the truth was dangerous. At the center of everything was one man, James McParlan. McParlan had lived as a miner for years. He shared bread with the men who would later hang. He drank beside them. He listened when they trusted him. And all the while, he wrote reports for the mine owners. After the executions, McParlan became a hero to the powerful. Newspapers praised him. Mine owners paid him well. Officials thanked him for saving order. But McParlan could not sleep. He had seen the faces on the gallows, men he knew, men who laughed, cried, and worked beside him. Some had spoken of violence, others had only spoken of survival. The trials had not separated the guilty from the desperate. They had crushed everyone in the way. The courts claimed justice was done, but the trials moved fast, too fast. Witnesses were rewarded, some were threatened, some were criminals themselves, promised lighter sentences if they talked. One witness admitted years later that he had been coached on what to say. Another said he was drunk during key moments he claimed to remember clearly. Yet the juries believed them, or maybe they were told to. Judges allowed evidence that should not have been allowed. Defense lawyers were denied time. Motions were ignored. The verdicts felt decided before the trials even began. The goal was not truth. The goal was fear. At the same time, America itself was breaking. The year 1877 was one of the most violent in U.S. labor history. Railroad workers across the nation went on strike. Cities burned. Soldiers fired on civilians. Dozens died. Leaders were terrified that the coal miners would rise next, so the hangings became a warning not just to Pennsylvania, but to the whole country. This is what happens when workers organize. This is what happens when you challenge power. Prison was no longer just a punishment, it was a threat. In the months after the executions, arrests slowed, violence dropped, mine owners declared victory. Newspapers said the Mollys were gone forever. But something else rose in their place: distrust. Workers no longer trusted each other. Anyone could be an informer. Anyone could be listening. Fear became part of daily life. Some miners left the region entirely. Others stayed and worked in silence. Wages remained low. Conditions stayed deadly. The only thing that changed was resistance. It had been strangled. Years later, new evidence began to surface. Letters written by condemned men before their deaths described forced confessions and false accusations. One man wrote that he was dying not for murder, but for belonging to the wrong group at the wrong time. Another insisted he had never harmed anyone. Historians began asking questions the courts never did. Why were only certain men targeted? Why were mine owners never questioned? Why was a private detective allowed to shape the fate of so many lives? The answers pointed to one truth. The prison hangings were not just executions. They were strategy. The state had learned how to use prisons to control society, quietly, legally, permanently. Executions moved inside prison walls across the country. The public no longer saw the rope tighten. Death became hidden, and hidden death was easier to accept. The Molly Maguires executions became a blueprint. When future labor leaders were arrested, they remembered 1877. When radicals spoke out, they remembered the prison yard. When fear was needed, the state pointed to the past. Look what happened to them. James McParlan eventually left the coal fields. He carried medals and praise, but also memories he could not erase. In private, he admitted that the system he served cared little for truth. It cared about control. By the time the century ended, the men executed in 1877 were rarely mentioned by name. They became symbols, villains in textbooks, shadows in history. But their deaths changed America. They proved that prisons could do more than hold criminals. They could silence movements. They could erase resistance. They could kill without witnesses. And once that door opened, it never fully closed again. Yet one question still refuses to disappear. What if some of the men hanged behind those prison walls were innocent? What if the real crime was not murder, but organizing? What if justice itself was the thing that failed? In the final chapter, the legacy of the 1877 prison hangings will come into focus. How their deaths shaped modern prisons, modern labor struggles, and the hidden executions that still happen today. The rope fell in silence, but its shadow still hangs over America. The rope did not vanish when the bodies were buried. Years after the prison hangings of 1877, the coal town still felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by fear. Fear of speaking, fear of gathering, fear of being named next. The men were gone, but the lesson remained alive. Inside the prisons, officials quietly studied what had worked. The executions had been hidden, controlled, legal. There were no riots afterwards, no martyrs in the streets. The silence had done the work. That silence became policy. Across America, executions moved further away from public view. Prisons grew stronger, courts grew faster. The idea took root that justice did not need witnesses to be real. And that idea spread. In Pennsylvania, labor leaders noticed something chilling.
Any worker who pushed too hard for safety or fair pay was suddenly called dangerous, radical, a threat, sometimes arrested, sometimes jailed, sometimes simply erased from leadership. The memory of 1877 hovered over every meeting. Parents warned their sons, "Keep your head down, do not organize, do not trust strangers. Prison is not a place to fix mistakes, it is a place to disappear." The families of the executed men lived with a different pain. Widows struggled to survive. Children grew up carrying a last name that marked them. Some were bullied, some were refused work. The punishment did not end at the gallows. For decades, their voices were ignored. But history has a way of reopening sealed doors. In the early 1900s, labor movements grew again. This time, workers demanded records, trial transcripts, testimony, letters. They wanted the truth buried in the files of 1877. What they found was disturbing. Witness statements that changed over time, confessions that appeared after long jail stays, jurors who admitted they feared violence if they voted not guilty, judges who privately expressed doubt but publicly stayed silent. One document stood out, a letter written by a condemned man the night before his execution. He did not beg, he did not threaten. He wrote calmly. He said he was dying not because he killed, but because he belonged. That letter was never read in court.
Historians began to say what the courts never would. The trials were not fair. That did not mean every man was innocent. Violence had happened. People had died. But the question was never fully answered. Who killed them? And why were these men chosen? The answer pointed upward. Mine owners controlled police. Police influenced courts. Courts protected power. The prison was the final link in the chain. By the time the rope was tied, the outcome was already decided. The hangings of 1877 were not about justice, they were about control. As prisons expanded across the nation, the same model appeared again and again. Arrest first, investigate later, punish quickly, hide the process. Executions became cleaner, quieter, more distant. The public stopped seeing death, and when people stopped seeing something, they stopped questioning it. This change shaped the future. Electric chairs replaced ropes, prisons replaced crowds, officials spoke of dignity, order, and law. But beneath those words was the same idea born in 1877. Kill quietly, let fear do the work. In labor towns, resistance never fully died. It waited, it adapted. It learned that open anger brought prison bars, so it spoke softly, organized carefully, trusted slowly. The legacy of the Molly Maguires hangings lived on in every cautious step. James McParlan faded into history, but his work did not. Private detectives continued to infiltrate groups. Informers became standard. Suspicion became normal. The prison was no longer just a building, it was a warning. Today, the prisons of America stand massive and silent. Millions pass through their doors. Executions still happen out of sight. Decisions are still made behind closed walls. And it all connects back to a year when the state learned a powerful lesson. Public death creates anger. Hidden death creates obedience. The men executed behind bars in 1877 were erased from headlines, but not from history. Their story sits at the root of modern punishment. A moment when justice stepped into the shadows. A moment when the prison became more than a place. It became a weapon. And yet, the story is still unfinished, because the questions they raised still matter. Who decides guilt? Who controls the courts? And how much truth can be buried behind stone walls before it finds a way out? In the next chapter, we will follow the long shadow of 1877 into the modern prison system, how its methods evolved, how its silence spread, and how the same patterns continue to shape justice today. The rope may be gone, but the system that tied it is still very much alive, and we are not done. The prison door closes with a sound that never changes.
It does not matter if it is 1877 or today. The metal still slams, the lock still turns, and once it does, the world outside stops listening. That sound is the real legacy of the prison hangings of 1877. Long after the ropes were cut down and the bodies buried, the system that killed those men kept growing. It learned, it improved, it became quieter, faster, and harder to question. By the early 1900s, officials no longer talked about the Molly Maguires. Their names faded from classrooms and newspapers, but their executions had taught the state something powerful. You do not need public fear if you control the process. Prisons expanded, laws became stricter, new crimes appeared on the books: conspiracy, incitement, threat to order. These words were flexible. They could stretch to fit almost anyone, especially workers. Labor organizers were watched closely. Meetings were infiltrated, notes were taken, names were written down. The same strategy used in the coal mines was now standard practice across America. Find the leaders, isolate them, arrest them, remove them quietly. No gallows in the town square, no crowds, no debate, just prison walls. Families of inmates learned the same lesson the miners had learned decades earlier. Once someone goes inside, the truth becomes hard to reach. Evidence disappears, stories change, time moves slowly, and silence does the rest. Executions changed too. Hanging gave way to electricity. Officials said it was more humane, more modern, more controlled, but the real change was visibility. Fewer witnesses, fewer questions. The public was told executions were rare, necessary, regrettable, and always just. The prison door stayed closed. In Pennsylvania, descendants of the executed men tried for years to reopen the cases. They asked for pardons, reviews, acknowledgement that the trials were flawed. They were denied again and again. Admitting error would mean the system had killed without certainty, and that was something the system could never allow. Because if the past was wrong, the present could be too. Historians continued to digging. They found private letters between mine owners and law enforcement, payments, promises, pressure. They found records showing that the same detective testimony was used in multiple trials, sometimes word for word. They found silence where answers should have been. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. The hangings of 1877 were not an accident of history. They were a rehearsal, a test run of a new kind of justice, one that relied less on truth and more on control, one that treated prison as a solution to social problems: poverty, protest, anger. Lock it up, hide it away, let time erase it. But time did not erase everything. In moments of crisis, the past resurfaced. During major strikes, leaders were arrested quickly. During political unrest, charges multiplied. During fear, prisons filled. Always legally, always quietly. The same pattern repeated. And always, someone would say, "This is for safety." That phrase has power. It had power in 1877. It still does.
Today, people argue about justice, prisons, and punishment. Some believe the system works. Others believe it is broken. Few realize how far back its roots go. Few know that one of its turning points happened when 10 men were executed behind stone walls to send a message that did not need words: obey or disappear. The Molly Maguires were labeled criminals, terrorists, threats to order. Some may have committed violent acts, that is part of the truth, but another part is harder to face. They were also workers with no power, facing a system that had already decided their fate. Their executions taught America that punishment could be used not just to respond to crime, but to prevent resistance. That idea never left. It simply changed clothes. As prisons grew, so did their influence. Entire towns were built around them. Jobs depended on them. Budgets grew. Voices calling for reform were pushed aside because once a system becomes normal, questioning it feels dangerous, just like it did in the coal towns after 1877. Parents still tell children to stay out of trouble, to avoid prison at all costs. They do not always explain why. They do not need to. The fear is inherited, passed down through stories, through silence, through warnings whispered at dinner tables. Do not get locked inside, because once you are, the truth may never come out. The prison hangings of 1877 were meant to end a movement. In some ways, they succeeded. The Molly Maguires disappeared. The mines kept running. The owners stayed rich. But in another way, they failed, because the questions never died. Were the trials fair? Were the executions just? And how many times since then has the same method been used on different people under different names? The rope is gone now, but the door still closes, and the sound it makes still means the same thing: control. In the next chapter, we will go deeper into how this legacy connects to modern incarceration, modern executions, and the systems that still operate in the shadows. We will follow the line from 1877 to now and ask the question no court ever wanted to answer. What happens when a system designed for justice learns that fear works better? The prison doors are still shut, and the story is still unfolding. The door closes, the lock turns, and the system breathes easy. That sound is still heard today, even if people no longer notice it. By the time the 20th century arrived, the lesson of 1877 had fully settled into American justice. You could crush unrest without crowds. You could end resistance without noise. You could use prison not only to punish crime, but to manage fear. What began with ropes behind stone walls evolved into paperwork, procedures, and policies. Clean, legal, quiet. Executions became rare in some places and routine in others, but always distant from public eyes. Courts relied more on deals, informants, and confessions. Trials became faster, appeals became harder. The prison had learned efficiency, and efficiency does not ask questions. Labor movements never forgot what happened to the Molly Maguires. Organizers studied history carefully. They knew that open defiance brought swift punishment, so resistance adapted. It became slower, smarter, more careful. But the system adapted too. New labels replaced old ones: radical, extremist, threat to public order. The words changed, but the purpose stayed the same: separate, isolate, remove. Always legally, always quietly. In Pennsylvania, the memory of the 1877 hangings lingered like a warning sign. Judges referenced them indirectly. Prosecutors pointed to them as proof that the state would act decisively. No one mentioned doubts. No one mentioned flawed trials, because admitting doubt would weaken authority, and authority once shaken is hard to rebuild. Families of the executed men continued pushing for recognition. Not revenge, not compensation, just acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. Decades passed. Files were lost. Witnesses died. Officials retired. Each delay made truth harder to reach. Time became another prison. Historians who studied the cases noticed a pattern that felt uncomfortably familiar. Whenever the economy struggled, whenever workers organized, whenever fear spread, arrests increased, prisons filled. Executions, even when rare, sent a message louder than words: do not challenge the system, or the system will challenge you.
This pattern repeated through wars, depressions, and social movements. The tools changed, the strategy remained.
By the mid-20th century, prisons had become massive institutions. Entire regions depended on them. Jobs, budgets, politics, all wrapped around incarceration. Once that happened, reform became dangerous because reform threatened livelihoods, just as in the coal towns. The connection was no accident. The prison hangings of 1877 proved something that would shape the future, that punishment could be used as policy, that justice could serve power, that fear could be engineered. Even today, executions happen behind walls, appeals are denied quietly, decisions are made far from public view. Officials speak of law and order, safety and stability. They use calm voices and careful words, but beneath it all is the same truth learned in 1877. Visibility creates resistance. Silence creates obedience. The men who died behind bars that year were not saints. Some likely committed violent acts. History does not erase that. But history also refuses to ignore this. Their deaths were used to scare, used to silence, used to teach a lesson far bigger than any courtroom verdict. They became an example, and examples last longer than bodies. Today, when people argue about prisons, executions, and justice, they often talk about numbers, crime rates, costs, statistics. They rarely talk about fear. But fear is the foundation. Fear of being labeled, fear of being isolated, fear of being locked away where no one listens. That fear was perfected in 1877. The rope was only the beginning. As long as prisons exist without transparency, as long as punishment happens without witnesses, as long as silence replaces scrutiny, the legacy of those hangings lives on, not as history, but as practice. The story of the Molly Maguires was meant to end behind prison walls, forgotten, buried, reduced to a footnote. Instead, it became a blueprint, a warning written not on paper, but in memory. And memory has a way of resurfacing, because every time a cell door closes quietly, every time a trial feels rushed, every time a sentence feels decided before it is spoken, the shadow of 1877 moves again. The system does not need ropes anymore. It has learned better ways. And that raises a final question that still has no answer. If justice learned to hide, how do you bring it back into the light? That question is not finished with us yet. The door is still closed, the lock is still turning, and the story is not over. The final truth does not arrive with noise. It arrives quietly, like a cell door closing for the last time. By the end of the 19th century, the prison hangings of 1877 were no longer spoken about in courtrooms or newspapers. They had done their job. The coal kept moving, the strikes weakened, the system survived. And that is how power prefers its victories. Not celebrated, not questioned, just accepted. The men executed behind bars that year became names carved into old records, their stories flattened into a single word: guilty. That word was enough to move on. But history does not forget so easily. Long after the gallows were dismantled, the effects of those hangings continued to shape American justice. Prisons became the answer to every problem: protest, poverty, anger, fear. Lock it away. If something cannot be fixed, isolate it. If it cannot be silenced, remove it. If it cannot be explained, punish it. That lesson was learned well. The families of the executed men lived with unanswered questions for generations. Some kept letters hidden in drawers. Some passed down stories in whispers. Others stayed silent, believing silence was safer. That silence was inherited. It moved from coal towns to cities, from labor camps to factories, from the 19th century into the modern age. Today, most people do not think about how executions moved behind walls. They do not ask why witnesses disappeared.
They do not question why justice became something handled out of sight. They are told it is necessary. They are told it is orderly. They are told it is fair. That is the final success of the system born in 1877, when people stop asking questions. The Molly Maguires were framed as monsters so the system could look clean, terrorists so prisons could look heroic, criminals so power could look innocent. That framing mattered more than the truth, because once a story is decided, the facts no longer threaten it. Some historians now say the executions were a tragedy of fear, fear of labor, fear of immigrants, fear of losing control. Others say they were calculated, deliberate, and strategic. Both can be true. Fear often leads to calculation, and calculation leads to cruelty. The hangings of 1877 marked the moment when punishment stopped being a response and became a tool, a moment when justice learned to hide, a moment when prisons became symbols of authority rather than places of accountability. That moment still echoes. Every time a trial feels rushed, every time a confession feels forced, every time a sentence feels final before the evidence is finished.
The shadow moves again. The men who died behind those walls never got to tell their full stories. Some may have been guilty, some may not have been, but all of them were used to send a message larger than their lives. Do not resist, do not organize, do not challenge power, or the door will close and no one will hear you. That is the real ending of the prison hangings of 1877. Not the rope, not the gallows, not the executions themselves, but the system they left behind. A system that learned silence works better than spectacle. A system that learned fear lasts longer than force. A system that still asks us the same question today. If justice happens where no one can see it, how do we know it is justice at all? The door is closed now. The lock has turned, and the story ends where it began, behind bars. If this story made you stop and think, you're not alone. These events still shape prisons and justice today. Subscribe to this channel for real American true crime that history tried to bury, because some truths only survive when we keep telling them.